Hi everyone, this is Stijn from Calibra, and I'm here to talk about the data mesh and how it's a new hope in data. First of all, let's take a look at what we at Calibra believe the problem is that most organizations face today. On the one hand, you have multiple new personas coming into data. For example, the privacy people, that role came into existence a couple of years back. Data engineers is a relatively new job description, and there's a wide variety of them. So whole new personas, and these are very different backgrounds. You know, somebody who's in privacy is often in legal, so you have to imagine them living in Word documents, for example, and writing policies. Whereas a data scientist is duking it out in Jupyter notebooks. The middle layer there, that's also becoming a big challenge for organizations because the number of tools in data to move data around, like ETL and pipelines and all sorts of other stuff, is also growing. So every year there are more tools available. But you and me, we're just people. We cannot learn new tools all the time, right? And then the bottom of this page, the infrastructure layer, that's where things are significantly changing as well, because the cloud players have a few years back entered this market. And in my view, they're very much disrupting the whole data management space as a whole. Data warehouses are going into the cloud, data lakes, data pipelines are going there, and so on and so forth. And for large organizations, these are multi-million-dollar, multi-year projects to move what they have in the on-prem ethics into their fuzzy clouds. Now, if these three combination of problems, if you try to solve that at the same level, that's not going to work. So from Calibra's perspective, you need to solve this at another level. And we call that level the level of the system of engagement for the data asset. Just like an organization has learned to master other assets, like, for example, IT assets, they have a service now, right? Or their talent assets, aka people, they have a workday. And that's where they organize their people, their process, their collaboration around that specific area. And that's where they can get the organization to work at scale. So from our viewpoint, this is happening and needs to happen in organizations around the world, specifically to learn how to master that data asset. And then obviously, all the different personas can collaborate there. You know, data engineers maybe call catalog APIs, privacy people fill in their impact assessments on the data map. And it needs to connect with a variety of tools and technologies that do data management. And obviously, it needs to work in a cloud world. And if we peel that back one level, then you'll see how such system of engagement for the data asset, we call it the data intelligence cloud, is composed out of various pieces, all the way from a catalog, lineage, governance, quality to privacy. And that needs to be in one place so that all these different personas can collaborate around the same data assets. And that's really Calibra's position in the market. Or in other words, if you ever need an Amazon for your data in your organization, that's an example of a problem that we solve. Now, let's take a broader look at our industry and why we are here today. We have to go back about a decade. And I want to specifically focus in on the chief data officer, who's since about a decade, just a little bit more, has become the de facto leader of data in organizations. So we're going back to the 2002s. This is when the first chief data officer existed. I believe it was at Capital One. So they were leading the pack, if you will. And then in 2010, you see that there are about 15 chief data officers worldwide. And these numbers are based on Gartner research. Now, why were there 15 specifically? If you look at it, the original chief data officers, the original data bosses, came into existence as a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, where the Bank of International Settlements in 2012 said, hey, banks, when you're doing your risk calculation, we need you to make sure that you know what those numbers mean and where they're coming from, and that the quality of that data feeding those reports is appropriate, right? So the banks, the largest banks in the world, aka the GSIBs, the globally systematically important banks, they needed to have a boss of data to take on that responsibility and that accountability. They started doing all sorts of data cataloging and governance and quality programs and so on and so forth. So the biggest banks in the world were sort of getting ahead of that upcoming regulation. In 2014, you're having 400 of those. That's now the globally systematically important banks, as well as the domestically systematically important banks. So financial services industry created that role, right? They were the first ones who almost had to do this. And that's why those data leaders were typically very defensive focused. And so you get a lot of perception about data bosses in that generation who are like the data police. Like, no, you cannot touch my data. But then, of course, as the role spread to all industries, you see 2017, 4,000, and by now there's over 20,000, so a long way still to go. But you essentially see how the original role was more defensively focused, and then the role evolved, right? So they added offensive data strategies. Then they started to support digital transformation, which is still ongoing today, of course. And I'm most excited about the version 4 of the Chief Data Officer, which is all about data products, which also happens to be a very key principle, or one of the 4 pillars in the data mesh, to look at data as a product, not just as an exhaust of something else, right? So that data product is what we're going to be talking about a lot, and which is what a lot of you out there in the audience are also working on, of course. And this is important because anybody who carries the role of a data boss in their organization, a CDO, is continuously challenged by the other executives. What is your value? What do you do? This is normal. This is a new executive role. So it's normal that they're getting a lot of headwind and a lot of challenges. They're building a data lake, but if nobody in the business is using that data lake or knows what's in there, then they can't use it, then they can't get value out of it. And so if you look at very recent research, you see that the CDO, that data boss, really has short tenures. And in that short tenure, they have to prove, here's what I'm doing, and here is how that is adding value to the organization. That's how they can build their careers and the careers of the people in their team. And right now, obviously your strategy needs to include some defensive, offensive, and all that stuff. You can't just forget about the past, right? So for the defensive stuff, you got to work with your legal counterparts, your privacy people, maybe with your security people, your CISO, etc. So you need to build those relations in the organization. If you're a data engineer, somewhere in your process, if you're building data products, you're going to have to connect with your privacy counterparts to make sure that the data product you're building is doing things with data that it's allowed to do, especially if it's using personal data. Then the people who that personal data belongs to, like if you're using my address, for example, or certain behavioral data, then you need to make sure that I have consented to that specific use. So how do we do this? Well, one important way is thinking about data in terms of data products, because there's 2 things that are important to that. One is, what does that look like? And the other end is, what does that process around it look like? So what does it look like is on the left-hand side of the screen. And you see, data as a product could mean that internally you're selling data maybe to other areas in your business, or externally you're literally selling data as a product to customers, right? So there's a big variety of things you can do there. But data products could also just be reports that the business builds themselves. Remember, self-service is another of those pillars for the data mesh. And then the queries, the dashboards, models, the most advanced version of a data product. So data products come in all shapes and forms, and it really depends on your organization and its current maturity as to what data product you can make work. For example, if your organization is currently incapable of doing any kind of even basic self-service BI, then you're going to have a very hard time having that organization sell data directly, right? There's a few steps that you still have to cover. Now, how do you do it? It it means if you're doing data as a product, it means you need to think about certain product process steps. For example, if I think about products, I think about an idea. First, the product has to be created. It has to be an idea somewhere. Maybe it's an idea that you came up with, or your partners came up with, or your customers came up with. But essentially, somebody saying, "Oh, this is a great idea for a product. Let's investigate this." Right. So then you start looking at the need. Right. Does my targeted business audience need that product? What is actually their problem that they're trying to solve? What is the value if, let's say, we build that product? What is the value that we're bringing to our organization? And then a whole bunch of other steps, including, iterating with your business stakeholders on that data product to make sure that it's going in the right direction, prototyping it, testing it, actually putting it into production, providing documentation around it. But then also now that data product is live, right? So somewhere there's pipelines running and data lakes humming, and you need to make sure that the lights are kept on, right? You need to monitor that data product. But then you also need to monitor from the angle, is somebody actually using that? Because if you build a data product and nobody is looking at it or using it, it's a little bit like a tree that is falling in the woods, right? Does it actually make noise? So that monitoring aspect is also important. Is my data product live? Is my intended business audience actually using it and getting the value from it? And that itself gives input to the next cycle of that data as a product, which is, okay, what's the next version? What's the next iteration? But data as a product thinking also requires you to think about not just the ideation phase of a data product, but also its sunsetting phase. At a certain point in time, the product has had its life cycle and it doesn't generate the value anymore. The problem has been solved, whatever it is. But you also need to think about sunsetting that data product. If there's people who are still dependent on it, for example, they need to know when it will be sunset and how and what kind of replacement there might be that could help them continue to do their specific part of the job. Right. So data as a product means there's a variety of ways of what that product could look like. And there's a number of process steps that you and your organization have to think about how to do this. And we have some more reading on these blog websites. And a very important part of thinking in data as a product is that value aspect that I talked about earlier. I like to refer to that as the data monetization part, which is also how MIT looks at it. But essentially, it means that you're not just building that data product to have fun with a new data technology, right? Or you're not just building that data product to have a beautiful dashboard somewhere. No, you're building that data product to deliver some sort of value to your organization. Maybe you're making the organization more money or saving some costs somewhere, whatever it is, but somehow you're converting the data directly or indirectly into financial returns. I see that a lot with self-service BI, for example. Those beautiful dashboards are being built. But again, if nobody's looking at them, then it doesn't help. Or if people are looking at them, but not making decisions based on it or not taking actions based on it, not making changes in their part of the business, then you're not getting to that value creation point. Right? It means that you've only spent resources and are continuing to spend resources on a pipeline is processing CPU credits, right? And the data is stored somewhere using a storage credit. So it's costing and it's continuing to cost. You need to make sure that it's also being used to generate that value. And there's a few aspects to think about in terms of that value. Again, got an MIT article for you to read upon that I like a lot. Essentially, you can look at it by improving an existing business process, right? So let's say you have a dashboard data product and your business counterparts are now having their business process be more efficient, right? So typically the accountable person you need to get on board as a user and a participant in a data product creation process is the process owner. On the other hand, you might also say you're wrapping an existing product or service with information. Think about it, for example, really very simple and naive example. You have a menu in a restaurant, but in the COVID times, we've all gotten these QR codes that you can scan. So that actually gives you the opportunity, you scan the code to deliver additional information around that menu. that could unlock additional value. So there, the product owner of that existing product or service becomes the person accountable. And obviously, you can also directly sell data, as we talked about earlier. But then the person accountable is almost somebody who's already owning a profit and loss function, because they know what it means for the organization to generate profit and to manage all the rest of the numbers. All right, so to be able to achieve that, there's a few components you need. Now, I assume you all know that you need a data asset, right? If you cannot build data products without having actual data somewhere, which could be master data, your list of customers, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, its most advanced stage is also curated data. Obviously, you need a data platform. That data needs to sit somewhere. The data product needs pipelines, keeping it up, needs a data lake to make sure that the lights of the data product can stay on. The data science pillar, there's also an important one. And remember, if you can't do proper reporting, it doesn't make a lot of sense to start hiring PhDs in physics to do data science, because your organization is still incapable of processing basic decision making and basic dashboards. So try to do some of those first layer ones before you try to make your organization grow to that more advanced stage. Customer understanding. Any data product that is not somehow helping a customer is not a very meaningful one. So how close can you get to your existing customers, your targeted customers, to learn about their needs and to get their feedback? Remember that monitoring aspect, right? It's not just monitoring of the data product, are the lights on, but also monitoring how and why and for what it's being used, and is the value being had. And then obviously not forgetting the last part, that acceptable data use. You need to think about privacy. You need to think about security. You need to think about your policies. Not, if this is a spectrum of data products that can be built, this is the spectrum of data products that actually offer value. And this is a spectrum of data products that you're allowed to build because of your company's policies or privacy settings. And if you build a data product that's outside of that scope, it might not generate the value you thought it was going to generate, or worse, it might cost your organization money because of your brand getting a reputation, a data breach happening, privacy violations, and so on and so forth. So again, work with your counterparts in privacy and security to make sure that what you're building is buildable and is being able to turn into value. Now, how are we doing this at Calibra ourselves? We've done this by adopting a data mesh approach. Calibra, I run the data office at Calibra, so I have a number of data scientists and engineers. But essentially, we started in our data office also with a data strategy. How are we going to use data to help support our business objectives? And in our case, we do that by being our own best customer, helping our business counterparts, sales, marketing, finance, with data products that they can build themselves, again, self-service and data mesh, but also that we can help them build in certain cases. Like, for example, one of my data scientists has helped some of our sales and customer success folks with a propensity model, for example. And I'm also offering a shared data infrastructure to the data folks across our organization. And the way I've organized that data office is a data intelligence pillar. This is where you have the governance representation, collaboration with the business, making sure that we have policies, standards, that we have certain roles and responsibilities and processes around data in place. Very important. Data engineering. Otherwise, you cannot have data infrastructure. Otherwise, your pipelines don't exist and don't run, and the lights don't stay on. And then data science, because somebody needs to be building the data products and helping, of course, our business stakeholders with some more advanced data cases. And then we at Calibra, we've done that by setting up some additional use cases. So we said, in our space, everybody needs to be able to do data shopping, right? So everybody needs to be able to see, I just joined Calibra as an analyst or a data scientist. Give me the catalog of data that I can go start playing with, right? What is available? And how can I shop for that data all the way from request to actual credit? metric certification. So when the business does get beautiful dashboards, that they can actually ask questions like, hey, but where did that data come from? Or how is this being calculated? Who's responsible for this report? So that they can get trust. And obviously, privacy is a very, very important topic. And community is where you work with your colleagues across the organization so people can start sharing data stories, for example. And here's an example of the use cases we're doing. Now, as I mentioned, we're doing all of this in a data mesh type approach. And compared to other data architecture approaches, you have data warehouses and data lakes and star schema approaches and a whole bunch of other things. And there's a lot of buzzwords in the industries about data always. The data mesh is slightly different because it combines architectural aspects with socio-technical / organizational aspects. For example, if you're a producer of data, because maybe you're the owner of a CRM system, for example, in the organization, then other people might be the consumers of that data to use it for their reports or their data products or whatever it is that they're using it for. So now there's a relationship between you as the producer and the consumer. You can expect an agreement, like what should the data look like, how often should it be refreshed, and so on and so forth, right? So you have that combination between both architecture and socio-technical aspects. And that's different from before, where a lot of times you had more legacy ownership, more top-down governance. In the data mesh, you look at domain ownership. For example, who is the owner of the customer domain when it comes to data, as an example, right? The second pillar of the data mesh is data as a product. Remember, we talked about earlier how data isn't just an exhaust coming from your company's systems or your processes, but data really should be looked at as an asset or as a product in itself, something, a data set, or a stream of data. Who is responsible for coming up with that idea and sunsetting all the way? At some point in time, like I said, the data product may not be necessary anymore, right? They have lived its product life. Self-service infrastructure, because ideally, everyone in the business, every analyst, every data engineer, every data scientist across the organization, whether they love working in spreadsheets like Google Sheets or Excel, or they're Tableau fans or Power BI fans, or they love to get deep down and dirty in Jupyter or R, you need to provide them with a self-service infrastructure so that as much as they're able to do themselves, they can do themselves. And then you have the fourth pillar of the data mesh, the federated computational governance. So let's look at how we approach this when you look at Calibra's data mesh. So just like every organization, at the bottom of this slide, you can see we have business systems, right? CRM systems, process systems like Jira, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a variety of systems that we use across our business that somehow generate all sorts of data. In the top right-hand corner, you see some of the data teams we have, right? So as you can imagine, in our marketing unit, there are people who are crunching data all the time, but also in finance, sales operations, for example. And just like any other modern day technology company, you also have all sorts of data analytics happen in your product and engineering teams. So these are all operations teams, data teams with analysts and scientists in them. And they're sitting in all sorts of departments across Calibra using those systems that we have at the bottom of the slide. Now, what was happening before is that before we started adopting a data mesh principle, is that these teams were functioning relatively isolated and they would just go directly into their source system, extract the data somewhere, take CSV or spreadsheet, put it in Tableau, make a dashboard on it. So we said, okay, we need to do better. Let's provide them with some data infrastructure. We put a data warehouse in place in the cloud. At Calibra, we're using Redshift, but any other one, BigQuery, Snowflake, perfectly fine. Databricks, a Delta Lake, you need a place where you can start putting a lot of data and you can power data products. And then we saw that, okay, if you have to build pipelines manually for all of those source systems, then we need way too many data engineers. So we started looking at ingestion capabilities. think technology like a 5-trend, for example, which allows you to automatically almost make a copy of the most commonly used, like Salesforce, NetSuite, others, business applications, and automatically make sure that every day, for example, there's a fresh copy of that raw data sitting on it. Then you reach the next step. Now that you have this raw data there, a lot of the analysts across the organization, they're already happy. They can do whatever they want. Every day the data is sitting there waiting for them. Perfect. The next step is then, okay, how can we make sure that these people can manipulate the data and that it's in a form that more easily suits their needs? Because when you're building a data product and you look at the raw data, they don't always match up, right? Oftentimes you need some transformation in between. So we offer them data preparation capabilities, like a trifecta, for example, so that they on the business side themselves, as an analyst, can do their analytics engineering work. Think trifecta, think tools like DBT and many others, right? How can business analysts make their own transformations, maybe just with knowledge of some basic SQL, for example, right? You don't want these folks to all have to learn Python and R all of a sudden. No, you want them to be able to self-service them with what they already know or some minimal amount of training. So now we have business stakeholders, data champions all across the business who can access their own data. They can use the catalog to search what data is available. Everybody who loads the data set into the warehouse registers that data set automatically in the catalog. They can shop for the data that's there. They can request access. They then, through the permissions, we use Okta, we use IAM. So through any permissioning setting, they automatically get the right credentials and they can start querying as soon as they get the AOK. Then they make their data product. Those data products are also registered and recorded in the catalog so that anyone in the organization, we call them data citizens, anyone who uses data to do their job, can now go and say, okay, I need to give an answer with customer information about such and such. And they can start looking in Calibra to immediately see, okay, this data products exist and I want to get a view on that dashboard, for example. So that way we have a whole data mesh in place with, like I said, self-service infrastructure, all the way from them being able to query, transform, load themselves, to requesting data, to requesting a data product, to shopping around for the data. We have domain ownership in place because we have different owners for different domains. We have federated governance, and we have, what's the last pillar again? Obviously, the data as a product with data products all over. So this is a very short summary as to how we are applying the data mesh at Calibra. Many of our customers are also big fans of the data mesh. So we've set up a community at Calibra where we collaborate with our partners to help develop the data mesh topic in the market, because it is a relatively new concept, about 3-4 years old. So there's a lot of runway still to make. And an important last part of that is that you need to make sure that you stay connected with all of those data stakeholders, data champions, data citizens across the organization. So the way we approach that, for example, is we highlight the data user of the month. We send out a data office monthly newsletter, like about exciting new data products, about exciting new use cases, etc. You have a data analytics community. People can share their stories. If you have 10 new colleagues in data starting, you actually know who they are. They can introduce themselves, like, what did you work on in data, et cetera, et cetera. So we use these different techniques to help keep the social network of data citizens and champions around the organization connected. And with this, I'm wrapping up my presentation. So if you want to learn more, we have a bunch of resources available on our free university. Community is out there. You're always welcome to stay in touch with me through email, LinkedIn, or Twitter. But remember, if you want to be successful in data today, you need to have a data strategy, which includes data monetization. And that means that in terms of the how to achieve that, the data mesh is perfectly suited, because it does provide that self-service idea to the business, with the business ownership, the organizational responsibility, and most importantly, the thinking of data as a product not just an exhaust of something else, but as a real product with value and a life cycle and a process to iterate it into next and more beautiful versions. So thanks for the short time together, and happy to follow up with you at any point in time. Have a nice day.